to Rutgers.
So we're going to move on to
I was at
the
Rutgers.
second panel, which is a panel focusing entirely on loss and damage. And I just realized that besides our excellent four speakers, we also have one of the founding women of loss and damage in person, Coco Warner, which is a nice addition to the panel. We would have been on the panel if we knew that she was going to be here in person. So I'll move on to the speakers, just with a brief introduction. So we have Professor Emily Boyd from Lund University, has been at the University of Reading, if I remember it correctly, pushed really hard to get loss and damage and non-economic loss and damage into the IPCC, and yeah, done some very, very brilliant work that I'm sure you're going to hear more of in a second. We have Professor Lisa Vanhala from UCL, who I would say is one of the leading UCL scholars on loss and damage, politics, knowledge making, and governance. And then Adele Thomas, who is with Climate Analytics, also an IPCC lead author, has done some amazing work on non-economic loss and damage, and a lot of capturing the local perspectives and empirical knowledge of loss and damage. And finally, but not least, we have Professor Timos Roberts from Brown University, who spent 15 years, I read, of researching the politics around the North and South constraints around UN negotiations. So I'll hand over to Emily to start.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Brilliant. Thanks so much for inviting me here today and us. We've just come from a workshop where we're talking about the governance and politics of loss and damage, organized by these guys here, Lisa and Adele. So I guess I just wanted to say a little bit about the point that was brought up by Sonia on the IPCC. So I've been an IPCC author in the Working Group 2, which is dealing with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And that's, I don't know how many of you know about the IPCC, but it's basically sort of state-of-the-art understanding, synthesizing the latest science on what we know about climate impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. And within this report, we're several hundred authors, and we're divided into different chapters. And the chapter I was involved in was the Poverty, Livelihoods, and Sustainable Development chapter, Chapter 8. But it wasn't only Chapter 8 that dealt with loss and damage this time, also several chapters, which is something new. So you've had a bit of an introduction to loss and damage, I believe, during this conference, so you have a bit of an idea about it. The way we think about it in our chapter is looking at the observed impacts and future risks that come about, let's say, where adaptation and mitigation have failed. So these are both economic losses, you might see, so the costs that are incurred. Some people talk about it as the residual risk. Those of you who study disasters can kind of understand that language. But we also talk about the costs, the non-economic costs. So more intangible aspects that are difficult to measure and difficult to then see how to connect it back into the larger loss and damage policy, which is really about how do we tackle this at a global level? How do we tackle losses broadly between global north and global south? But it's also connected to greenhouse gas emissions and the whole climate problem itself. So, so just to sum up there, we for the first time brought in a much deeper understanding of this notion of loss and damage. And many of you who are disaster scholars may say, oh, but isn't this just about disaster and disaster risk reduction? And some people do talk about comprehensive risk management. But the way I think about it is think about disasters, but disasters that are now maybe 5 times as severe due to anthropogenic climate change. And that connection also then connects to vulnerabilities and root causes of vulnerabilities, which are development related, historical, and so on. So it's a more complex picture of how we deal with extreme events. It's more a complex picture of how we deal with slow onset change. So things like sea level rise and so on, where people may be displaced or will be displaced, I should say, eventually. So it's a more complex picture. So I'll just start off saying it's definitely a thing, loss and damage. It's in the IPCC, and that also then comes then into policy and political discussions in new ways. And I'm going to then hand over to Lisa at that point.
That's great. Thank you, Emily. And a lot of my work kind of picked up on where kind of Coco and Adele and Emily's work was kind of pushing. And there's a lot of room in this literature for kind of a new generation of scholars. There's like so many burning questions about the types of things that we look at when we think about loss and damage. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing in the Department of Political Science here at UCL. And I have a great team of early career scholars that support me in this. And then maybe put some questions out that, you know, for students that are thinking about dissertation topics or kind of future research about the types of things that you might want to think about when we're thinking about loss and damage with a political science or political sociology type lens. So a lot of my early work on loss and damage was really thinking about what is it that we mean when we talk about loss and damage. And Emily has a wonderful piece with some co-authors kind of unpacking how different actors within the UNF CCC space understood what loss and damage is, because there is no kind of consensus definition of this term loss and damage. And so some people understand it in a very kind of existential way, right? We have this idea that some states might disappear because of loss and damage, whereas we have at the other end of the spectrum another set of actors who really understand this as a kind of part of adaptation and don't understand it kind of in the same existential way that for example, those in small island developing states might think about it. And so what I tried to do in an early piece on this was really think about, well, how do these frames or discourses of loss and damage begin to translate into institutional arrangements, right? And how do we then make decisions about what kinds of knowledge is produced, whose interests are advanced, who gets what, right? You know, if we think about the study of political science as a question of who gets what, when, where, and how, you know, when in unpacking the politics of loss and damage, that's what I was trying to understand at that UNFCCC level. And what I found was that there were really kind of about 10 years ago, there were really two quite distinct framings of what loss and damage is. On one hand, you had a framing that really emphasized the idea of risk and the idea of insurance as a potential solution to the problem of climate risk, right? And this risk framing really emphasizes uncertainty, right? We don't know if these impacts are going to happen. We don't know if they're climate driven. We don't know where they're going to happen. So a lot of emphasis in the rhetoric on this idea of uncertainty, and therefore how do you build institutions to deal with something that is so uncertain, right? So we had one set of actors, mainly developed states, advancing this kind of narrative. And so the problem was kind of diagnosed as one of risk, and the prognosis was, you know, a certain set of kind of risk transfer mechanisms, namely insurance, right, 10 years ago. On the other side, you had more of a climate justice framing of what loss and damage is. Rather than talking about risk, we talked about loss, we talked about harm, we talked about injustice, right? And there you had a corollary set of solutions to this problem, which concerned kind of identifying who is responsible for those problems of harm, right? So liability, responsibility, and compensation as the appropriate kind of matching response to that particular problem. And this began to translate into the way the institutions have been set up within the UNFCCC, right? This raised questions about, is loss and damage a part of adaptation, or is it something that's separate? Is this something that the UNFCCC should be dealing with at all? If we really don't know whether disasters are caused by climate change, maybe this should be dealt with in a different realm. And you know, people would argue for the kind of relevance then of the Sendai framework, right? And use those tools of disaster risk management instead of dealing with this within this climate change regime. And that had certain implications, right? Because the climate change regime has a different legal basis and standard than the Sendai framework, which is versus voluntary and more of a form of soft law. So what I'm really interested in is how do we understand what loss and damage is, how is that evolving, and how does that then translate into different institutional mechanisms? So some of my more recent work has been looking, for example, at the issue of displacement more specifically, and how do different framings of climate displacement or climate mobility begin to translate again into some of these institutions. And what we understand is certain framings of loss and damage are beginning to trickle down into these other issues, and that shapes how these institutions are developed and designed and who gets what out of these institutions and who doesn't. I'm now going to turn over, I'm going to give Adele her title back, because I think Sonia missed that maybe in the rush. And so Dr. Adele Thomas, who is also affiliated with University of Bahamas, as well as sitting in that practitioner space in the work that she does at Climate Analytics.
Yep. Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. So the work that I have done on loss and damage has really focused on small island developing states, looking at how they have been strong advocates for advancing loss and damage within the UNFCCC, but also on how they deal with loss and damage in their own national contexts. So how are their policies, are their institutions set up at the national and subnational scale to deal with loss and damage within these small islands, who have been some of the main advocates at the international scale for attention to be paid to loss and damage. Another thing that I've been really active in as an IPCC author, and I'm on chapter 16, which is key risks. So we use this risk framing to look at loss and damage. Is I've been doing research on limits to adaptation. So when can we no longer adapt to the impacts of climate change? And a good example of that is if we think of sea level rise. So if we have 1 meter, 2 meters of sea level rise, what does that mean for coastal communities that are now going to be completely flooded? And then there's a link between adaptation and loss and damage. So an adaptation strategy may be like, we're going to relocate an entire community somewhere else. And that's sort of called transformational adaptation, but it has then a link with loss and damage, because you're losing an entire community, you're losing their values, you're losing their livelihoods that may be associated, and non-economic losses. So people bring up graveyards, right? So your ancestors are buried in a specific place, which is now underwater. That's a serious non-economic loss. And also the trauma that goes along with that. And what young people may be interested in is one of the non-economic losses is just fear of the future, or what type of future will you have, which is particularly relevant in the small island context, where we have to talk about climate change in a way where it's not so scary, like we won't have a country in the future. So all of these things are sort of tied up in loss and damage, adaptation continuum, and that's sort of the space that I've been operating with. Thanks.
Thank you, Adele. Is that close enough? Do I need to be that close? Hi, everybody. Good to see you. My name is Timos Roberts. I'm at Brown University. I run something called the Climate and Development Lab there, and something else called the Climate Social Science Network, which is a global network now of about 330 scholars looking at obstruction to climate change action. So I've been studying the negotiations for now about 20 years, and the issue of equity on climate change for longer than that. And my core sort of belief is that we're not going to solve climate change until we address issues of equity. That equity is often seen as an obstacle to progress on climate change, but in our view, it's really a necessary part for all participants to feel like they're getting a fair shake so that they will do their best. We're always looking around us to see what other people are doing, to decide how much we're going to do. And this is definitely the case in the UN negotiations. We'll go much further if we go together, as they said in the South Africa COP with the Conference of Parties. So I used to work on climate finance, and then I realized that loss and damage is quite an important part of finance. And what's really at the bottom of loss and damage is that the wealthy countries have created damages that we need to help the developing countries adjust to. And what's at the bottom of it is finance. So in 1991, Vanuatu, a small Pacific island, right, part of the Association of Small Island States, put in a proposal for the AOSIS group for an insurance mechanism that said that wealthy countries should pay into this insurance. It would be subsidized insurance, and 50% of that would be based on how much of the problem we created, so our responsibility for it, and 50% would be based on our capability, that is, how much money we have. And those are really core principles that are at the heart of all the climate negotiations that in 1992 in the UN Framework Convention, we all agreed, that is, every country in the world agreed, that we would avoid dangerous climate change, and we would do it based on the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. That is, we're all responsible, but some of us are more responsible, right? Common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which means some have more money to address problems. This was a core demand of the developing countries, and it's not gone away. So again, back to this idea that equity is at the heart of progress on climate change, and I guess I would say for your conference on risk avoidance and reduction and recovery and so on. So that was 1991, Vanuatu put that proposal in. We're in 2022, and we still don't have any mechanism to fund developing countries' losses and damages. Nothing. We've had like $1 million or £1 million or whatever it was, euros from Scotland, right? A pledge from the Prime Minister. We had another pledge of like $1 million from somebody else. Does anybody remember this? Wallonia, yeah. So one of the Belgian territories, right? Those are just token, but they were out, and they were given outside of the UN process. So they're interesting because they've sort of broken through taboo, which was that the wealthy countries would admit that we're responsible for this problem, or we have some moral responsibility. For all these years, there's been obstruction of climate change, action on loss and damage. So that's what I study now, is obstruction of climate action. And it's much more complicated than just Exxon and the Koch brothers and stuff like that. That it's in almost every sector of the economy. It's in all kinds of government and intergovernmental organizations. It's at your local level and your national and the international level. So this is what this whole network, the Climate Social Science Network that I'm working on, works on. So in obstruction to loss and damage, there's a lot to talk about. I don't know how much you really want, but we've just done a paper for this great workshop over with Lisa and Adele and Elisa, and anyway, we want to thank them for inviting for that. But this team of 7 authors pulled together a sort of history of loss and damage, obstruction, back from that Vanuatu proposal and how it was excluded from the agenda. And there was only an agreement to work on this stuff through workshops. And then a second period was in the late aughts, or whatever everybody calls them, the 2000s, where there were negotiations in Bali and Poznan, and then leading to the Warsaw International Mechanism. That's really the only achievement, the main achievement really on loss and damage by these developing countries. In which, and it happened because these Association of Small Island States and the least developed countries, the 48 poorest countries in the world, got together in a sort of coalition in which they advanced the proposal for a text, and it managed to actually get through in Warsaw. There's a lot of stories about that, but the response has been to try to weaken it and to keep it in discussion stages, to even pull funding for organizations that help the least developed countries write that proposal. There is a little bit in the Paris Agreement, right, in Article 8 about loss and damage, which is worth reading, but it's pretty pretty crummy language, and it, again, has no finance mechanism. And then finally, since then, there's been more efforts. For example, in the Madrid conference, there was something called the Santiago Network on avoiding, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, and then a Glasgow loss and damage facility. But none of these have any funding. So what we're doing now is trying to come up with sort of a typology and say, all right, what have been the strategies for blocking this? How did the wealthy countries manage to avoid this for 31 years, 32 years now? And it's quite a quiver that they have of different strategies, like openly rejecting the validity. For example, in the Paris negotiations, the US said, we will not even talk about compensation or liability for losses and damages. And they managed to, with other colleagues from the global north, get something called paragraph 51 in the decision document, which there's a Paris Agreement, and then there's this decision document, which is on the implementation of it. And it says that compensation and liability for loss and damage will not be part of this. There will be no liability and compensation. I could go on about these. Anyway, there's sort of strategies to limit the scope, to reduce transparency, to manipulate the concepts, and pushing really non-transformative solutions and saying, looking at all these great things we're doing, including on sort of humanitarian and risk reduction kinds of things, and using those as a delay, a distraction technique to keep the pressure off of them for doing something real about loss and damage.
Thank you so much for that excellent introduction. So we've heard a lot about loss and damage today. We also heard quite a lot yesterday during the conference. We had Professor Salim Cook on the panel who gave his also very provocative idea around loss and damage and the needs. So I'll ask a few questions to the panel now to set the audience up and give you a chance to think about questions of your own to the panel. And my first question is around precisely why is it that a concept like loss and damage has generated such strong feelings and opinions? By whom, or who has the strongest feelings? Could be countries, actors, alliances, and for what actual reasons, since we are saying that we're going to think about the topic critically and not only communicate what people may be saying, but the actual politics behind. And I'll open it up, and anyone who feels like you want to have a first go ahead.
Sure. So I guess the first thing that pops into my mind is the talk of compensation is a massive issue in the international negotiations. I mean, it opens up Pandora's box when it comes to historical emissions, who's responsible, who's going to pay who, how are you going to measure it, and where does that lead to in terms of, the negotiations and actually making progress, I suppose, has been some of the obstruction in some ways, or, the obvious stuff. But then Timons has got some good, less obvious stuff about, why people are, obstructing and putting in place or using techniques and strategies for their different interests, I guess. Anyone else want to hop in?
Just to kind of echo that, I think it's coming from the political science lens, the way I think about it is kind of the sets of interests, right? And then a question of identities. So there are interests on both sides, right? So developed countries maybe want to avoid issues of liability or responsibility. And, and when we start to unpack these difficulties of attribution and responsibility and who pays and kind of over time, there's a set of kind of debates to be had within the global north on that. But I also think loss, right? This idea of loss, this is my kind of dime store psychology analysis, and Sonia, you're much better placed to speak on this than I am, but loss generates strong feelings, right? And so there's something about politically, how do we build institutions that are able to kind of grapple with loss. And it's something I don't have a clear answer to. I'm working on a book on this. That's going to be the last chapter. I haven't really thought about it, but one of the ways I think we might think about this is where else as an international community have we grappled with loss? And so what we might want to do is look, for example, I have wonderful colleagues in the Conflict and Change group in the Political Science Department here who look at issues of genocide and post-conflict reconstruction and truth and reconciliation processes and amnesties. Where else can we look for examples that we as an international community have grappled with loss? And so I think that's where the strong feelings come from. It's not just about feelings of guilt and compensation and liability. It's also on the flip side, the loss that people are experiencing now and the loss that we know is coming.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on Lisa's comments about loss, and one of the most strong advocates we've seen is the Alliance of Small Island States, who are faced with the loss of their very existence of their territories. So in 1991, which Timmons mentions, the proposal, it was all about sea level rise and what's going to happen when these islands are lost, when they no longer exist on a map. And I think that has really been a pushing factor, is that small islands are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, despite all of them collectively contributing less than 1% of the emissions that drive climate change. And so this disproportionate experience of permanent loss has really led the SIDS to be strong advocates for loss and damage within the process. And I think, unfortunately, it's turned into, it's all about compensation and liability, when if you look at just that, we may not be around, it's, you know, a very existential way to think about this is why it's such a big deal, and this is why, you know, we see these groups keep pushing forward on it.
I want to recognize all the arguments that have just been made. They're wonderful. And I want to make another that's going to be provocative, I hope. Where do our national interests come from? Who decides, you know, what is the position of the UK or I'm from the US, right? Who decides that it's not that we want to fight tooth and nail for 31 years against any equity-based proposal on climate change? And this is one of the core ones. For example, and I would answer that with, well, it's organized interests. Who are the organized interests? In 1991 and 92, the first framework convention was being negotiated, and the U.S. coal industry realized very quickly what that meant for them. And they organized, and they used the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, and they got organized. They created something called the Global Climate Coalition, which hired the best public relations firms to coordinate all the major industrial players in the United States to first weaken the UN Framework Convention so that it was voluntary, basically had no binding mechanism, and then they managed to undermine the Kyoto Protocol and so on. So I would say, I don't find that it's necessarily in my country's long-term interests to oppose equity-based solutions on climate change, but these very strong industrial interests are very well organized and very well funded. And I don't want to say at all that it's impossible for more, morally driven interests to get in there and influence things, but they've so far not been organized enough and influential enough.
I'm going to build onto the meaning of loss and damage, and I have the privilege of not being a native English speaker, which is actually quite good in some senses. So I worked on loss and damage for quite some time without really thinking about the English meaning of the concept. And then one day I was going to a yoga session, and there was this poster on the door walking in that your insurance company is responsible for your losses and damages. And it kind of struck me that this is about insurance. And it kind of took me back to realizing, well, maybe that's why there's such strong feelings and opinions around the concept as well. Because who like the insurance companies? I think a lot of people feel like they're a bit dodgy. So what are your thoughts
I like
about
'em.
the values?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think I certainly also often encounter when I talk about loss and damage, people equate it to insurance straight away. So they think, oh, this must be a really boring professor because all she's going to talk about is insurance. But that's furthest from what this is. And I mean, in a way, what we're seeing here is a concept idea being created. It's in the making, but not just out of thin air. It's coming out of material realities where things are coming together, both from your side, the disasters, the risks, and so on, which we know are not just events that happen. It's about vulnerabilities, it's about root causes, and so on and so forth. But that is coming together very strongly and fast together with climate change and let's say, the different exacerbated effects that climate change causes, right? So that in that, there is something about the losses that we will incur or we are incurring, but it's also about losses that have incurred over the last 500 years and so on. So all of this is coming at once under this sort of justice heading. And then we need to bring in philosophers like our colleague up there, hi Ivo, who's also here, to help explain what justice is and what fairness is and that, because then you get into really complex, really important, deep discussions about moral responsibility and so on. So I guess it's like so loss and damage is a lot more than insurance, right? So it's actually an opener for a dialogue, because if we were chatting here now, we're already having a conversation here. Does anyone else want to add in there? How is it, Adele, with insurance?
Yeah, I think insurance, back to the Vanuatu proposal in '91, it was a proposal for an insurance mechanism. But over time, we've seen that insurance is just simply unable to deal with the entire breadth of loss and damage. So as risks increase, and particularly we know that they will increase because we have the scientific evidence that is showing us what's going to happen with extreme events, then that risk becomes uninsurable or too expensive for people to buy. And there are places that are no longer, where insurance is no longer offered. So I'm from the Bahamas. We have certain portions of our islands where you can't buy insurance for a hurricane because they know that it's going to be completely destroyed. So you can't even buy insurance. And then insurance is completely irrelevant for slow onset events, and then also for non-economic losses. So you're going to get insurance for trauma that you experience when your whole family is swept away by something, so it's increasingly through the years, it's come out that insurance may be able to deal with one aspect of loss and damage, but it's far from a holistic response to the full breadth of loss and damage. But unfortunately, we're still seeing the pushing of insurance as the solution. So Germany, with their global whatever they call it, something, which they're proposing even at the UNFCCC intersessionals, which we just came from. They're pushing this Germany-funded global insurance thing as a solution to loss and damage when it's clear that it's not. So we still have quite a lot to do to show that insurance is not the only solution.
Just one thought. We, in my lab group, was asked by the least developed countries to do a review of how we would fund loss and damage mechanisms. And in the Warsaw International Mechanism, there's a list of some of them, and several of them are insurance-based approaches. And so the main thing is that these are generally poor people, and they don't have any insurance. And for them to afford insurance, it's going to have to be highly, highly subsidized. So where's the money going to need to come from? So, we reviewed some things that have been put out there before, like a fee on every international airline flight, €5 or pounds or dollars, whatever, for a coach economy fare, and 30 for a first class or something, would raise $5 or $10 billion or euros or pounds a year. We're going to need more than that. So other things like bunker fuel taxes, which are, on shipping, international shipping, or an international transaction tax or something. In other words, it seems like we need some kind of international mechanism to raise the funding, because if it all has to go through national treasuries, there will be a lot of politics, and it'll get held back, almost certainly, for teachers and firefighters and so on. But anyway, some of these have, the ones that I've just mentioned have implications for small island states and other places that are relying on tourists and a lot of transport of food and other necessities. So they're all very complex, but they've really never been well taken up and discussed.
I'll ask one last question before I hand over to the audience. And my question will relate to what we're doing here at IRGR in relation to loss and damage. It's a quite new area for us, but I just joined that brings a bit of loss and damage, and I think mainly non-economic loss and damage. So I've spent a lot of time looking at Bangladesh and linked to non-economic losses such as mental health, but also identity, livelihood. So I think both Emily raised it and Adele now as well. So how do we, like, what is the way forward? How do you compensate, or how do we tackle non-economic losses? For example, if someone loses a house to a flood, migrates, and ends up in a slum in Dhaka, and as a result of just the losses of the livelihood and identity is unable to work and just not find joy in life, and maybe loses, you know, not only mental health and well-being as such, but also time with their children and joy, or someone who loses a family member to a cyclone and spends a year or even 5 years with post-traumatic stress or anxiety disorder. So how do we tackle those issues? Is there a way? And what's being said and put forward as solutions?
I can't answer that question, Holly, but I would turn it back to you guys also to, I think that the experiences and lessons learned over, I don't know how long DRR studies have been going, have a lot to offer when it comes to those questions of on the ground, like how you deal with trauma, how to connect to the climate community. So I would recommend people to start to look at the connections to climate change. Understanding what is to come, read the IPCC reports, summary reports and things like that at the student level. I mean, when you put it all together like that, I mean, clearly you're going to have mechanisms. We've also been talking about today national mechanisms that can deal with both of these tensions, the climate and the, I guess, the disaster risk reduction aspect together. We're not there by far. You had Salim here yesterday, and I don't know if he talked about the Bangladesh loss and damage mechanism at the national level. A little bit, but they're sort of at the forefront of this and developing this. We have yet to learn a bit more about how it's evolving. But certainly when you put it all together like that, we're going to have to create mechanisms at different scales that take this really seriously. And we're just at the beginning of this, I would say.
Yeah, Sonia, that's a big question. That's a big question. I don't purport to have an answer either. Maybe what I would do is I kind of encourage people to look into the literature on transformative adaptation, right, and transformation, and our colleague Aaron Roberts has written about that. I've been really inspired by Coco Warner, who I've had conversations about kind of visioning exercises and thinking through that kind of thing. I've come from quite a pessimistic place. I have a difficulty kind of answering that question. But one thing I've been quite inspired by, and we talked about Emily's paper this morning, which looks at kind of national level responses to loss and damage events. And with my team, we're writing a book on a similar topic. And one of the things that we found is, you know, that loss and damage language or lingo doesn't necessarily translate to the national level, and the way that people talk about some of these issues is very different. And so the kind of sets of, you know, ministries or institutions that are involved with what we call loss and damage isn't what we would necessarily identify at the global level. But, you know, when I think about non-economic losses, I look to kind of human rights responses, human rights mechanisms, thinking about kind of social, economic, and cultural rights as one potential way of kind of thinking about a framework of like what are people owed and what are the duties of the state. But I also agree, I think that kind of regional level is set to play a very big role in thinking through some of these things.
Yeah, I just want to bring in that non-economic losses are sort of the things we've been talking about, health, trauma, all of that stuff, but then it's also loss of biodiversity and loss of species. So it affects the natural world as well, and loss of ecosystem services, which are quite important for us. So I'll use the example of a coral reef. So you lose a coral reef because of ocean acidification, and that would be a non-economic loss. But then it's linked to economic losses because you also lose fishing, right? So reefs are very important for biodiversity, which is then related to the types of fish that you catch. So you no longer have fishing as a livelihood, perhaps. It's related to tourism. So where are our British people going to come to go scuba diving if there is no coral reef there? And then it's also related to coastal protection. So when we have hurricanes or floods coming in, that coral reef is no longer there to provide protection. We're going to need some type of other protection through technology or something else. And so those all have costs. So there are links which can be made between non-economic losses and things that we can cost and put a value to.
I can pass. It wasn't my my wheelhouse. No.
So we'll open up to the audience. I think we'll see a question there. Maybe, I see a question up here. Maybe we'll try to take 3 questions at a time and then get an answer from the panel and then another 2. It's great to see so many questions.
Thank you, Sahil Shah. I guess my question was around incentives and climate security. So from the outset, it's abundantly clear that developed countries don't have a clear incentive to pay for loss and damage. However, if you view it through a climate security lens and a climate migration lens, across national risk registers, you have climate-induced migration as a national security risk ranging from the UK to the US. My question is, has there been any success in using a national security lens with developed countries, especially when you have institutions like the US Pentagon that have a discretionary budget exceeding $700 billion a year alone?
And we had another question, and if something closer, we unfortunately only have one microphone, so let's try again.
I'm passing that to Tim. Yeah. I can speak to the phone. So.
Hello everyone, thanks for such an insightful discussion. I'm Josh Anthony, I'm a second year PhD student at IRDR. My question is loosely directed at Professor Emily, but I'd be happy to have an answer from anyone. And it relates to perceived losses or damages. So sustainable or natural solutions to environmental risk can sometimes be met with resistance from local landowners, as there is a perceived lack of hard action. So my question is, how can we navigate the issue of policy supposedly designed to improve lives ending up being seen as a loss to residents? Thank you.
I think there was a question there, so we can make 3 and then...
Yeah, thank you. So it's Marcus Oxley. So I've just come back from the Global Platform in Bali, and the central conclusion of the Global Assessment Report, which is the UN's report on the state of the world disasters, is that we are still creating risk faster than we're able to manage that risk. And even under the UN's own projections, by the end of the what we call the Sendai framework, they're projecting a 40% increase in disaster losses. So we're going in the exact polar opposite direction as to where we're meant to be going. Now, the point is really, the critical issue is about how do we make sure that our development is risk informed, that it's not creating the same loss and damage and increase in vulnerability and exposure. So the solution really is about our development processes and how we can transform or adapt our development processes. So I just wonder if we're losing ourselves in this, in that if you're saying after 30 years of trying to argue a case for loss and damage, which is meeting a lot of resistance for whatever reason, that we need to flip this and say, actually, the solution is about how do we turn the adversity into an opportunity, and how do we shift our development model into one that is inherently more sustainable and resilient. Now, it's interesting when you talk to the private sector about risk, because they see risk in a much more positive connotation. They see it as about opportunity to grow and to develop. And yet when we talk about risk, we always see it in a negative way. We talk about negative risk and about loss and damage and all that type of connotations of understanding risk, where it's also about, it's looking at where the opportunities are to disrupt our status quo and to transition to a more sustainable development pathway. Now, if that comes out of climate finance or development finance or humanitarian finance or DRR, what does it matter? It just needs resource to be able to model the way and show how to make this transition to a more inclusive, sustainable development pathway. I just feel we're constantly fragmenting this argument, which ultimately is about unsustainable development, which is manifesting itself in economic, environmental, social, manifestations of that. And if you go down to the community base, people see it just as an issue about their lives, their livelihoods. They don't differentiate into all this complexity of jargon that we have in the institutional architecture. So I just wonder if we've created the mother of all fragmentations here with this whole environmental debate. Now, if it does get resource, great, but think about the critical issue is about changing our development pathways and where the opportunities are, where the synergies are, where the leverage is to be able to do that.
Thank you. I would think out loud and wonder if those private people who see opportunities are the dodgy insurance companies. Let's move on to the panel.
Yeah. Oh, sorry to answer. Yeah, I mean, to take the first, I think the first question there was about dealing with bad development, basically. So maybe they're quite connected, those two questions, right? Yeah, I agree with you. It's about creating development pathways that are sustainable ultimately, right? But what we're talking about here, actually, I think it's a very small minority of people who are talking about loss and damage, really. So we might seem like there's a lot going on with this because we're super in it and we're part of a discussion that we're observing the changes that are happening out there. We're not creating the discourse. We're contributing to it, but we're also observing and critically analyzing why this thing comes about, who's it for, and what it represents, and so on. So I guess, look, taking from what you said, it's really important for us as well to connect it to the importance of resilient development pathways. And that, so I can only agree with you in that regard. I think that probably some of us who have worked in development for a long time, or climate or disaster risk reduction, we do tend to look at vulnerability. We do tend to focus on inequity and seeing the kind of same reproduction of inequality. So I guess we, in a way, are keeping the lens on that, simply because if there's not some of us keeping the lens on that, we might miss that is a really critical part of creating sustainable development and resilient pathways as well, overcoming those obstacles, overcoming those inequalities. And that's embedded within loss and damage. So it's not to take away from your point.
Yeah, I might speak to that last point briefly and then come back to the first question about climate security and kind of incentives there. And I think Sonia kind of was echoing my thoughts there as I was listening, and I think that all makes sense. But the risk is when we talk only about development, we talk only about development pathways, where do we put responsibility? We put responsibility on the leaders of those countries that have done least to contribute to the problems that they are now facing. So we have to have this wider dialogue if we're really going to live in any kind of world that takes into account that responsibility. And I see it as a narrative that's constantly used to push responsibility away. And you know, we all share responsibility on some level, but some of us have been more responsible than others. And so I agree with you, but we also have to be aware that that's a rhetoric that's used in certain ways in the spaces that we're watching. And so I see that used. And the point about kind of private interests and bringing that in, I mean, you know, maybe they see risk as a positive thing because they're going to make money from it, and who's going to bear the cost of that? Where is the harm going to fall? That would be, I suppose, my counter argument to that. I think the climate security framing is a really interesting one, and I can only really speak about it in kind of my understanding of what the discussions have been like in setting up a task force on displacement within the UNFCCC. And what we did see in kind of the early IPCC discussions about linkages between human mobility and climate was it tended to be a securitized framing. And that was coming a lot out of the US, as you were saying, and kind of John Kerry talked about that, and that framing tends to then mean, you know, developed states are putting up borders, right? Like strengthening border security. An appropriate response is kind of let's strengthen our border. There are counter framings that have emerged in this space, and I think some really, really interesting and exciting kind of different work is being done. So looking at some of the expertise that's been brought to bear by UNHCR, IOM, for example, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, they take more of a protection framing, right? And they shift focus from like, let's put up borders to like, let's offer these people some protections, either in a very kind of operational way or in terms of developing new norms in international law, right? What are climate refugees? You know, whether we want to use that term or not is a whole separate set of debates, but what are those people owed? And what we then see is also a third framing emerging as like, you know, migration isn't all negative, right? We have this kind of migration as a climate, as an adaptive response to climate change. And I think the final thing I suppose I'd want to say about that is there's a lot of focus on those people that move related to climate change, and there's been less emphasis, though, you know, Sonia and Coco Warner, who's here, have been really leading the way in thinking about what about those people who aren't able to move, right? The kind of immobile and questions of immobility. So hopefully that's a kind of useful starting point for you in thinking about climate security.
Yep, I'll just pitch in briefly. The IPCC's latest Working Group 2 report, there's a whole chapter on climate resilient development, which brings together adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development. And it's a way of bringing in this need to develop in a climate resilient way that sort of picks up on some of the questions that you were raising. However, one of the key findings is that despite sustainable development or climate resilient development, we're still going to experience loss and damage. So we're experiencing it now, and we will continue to experience it in the future. So it is something that needs to be addressed. So we can't just say it's all about development. And then another key finding is that climate resilient development is actually not possible for some places if we exceed 1.5 degrees of warming. So again, that puts the onus back on big emitters to limit temperatures, because no amount of development is going to be able to prevent the impacts and risks that will be faced in a warmer climate for particularly vulnerable places.
My colleagues have made great points. Just on the issue of securitization, I think there is a risk that I think Lisa was getting to of, you know, sometimes the interests line up on security, that national security would support a greater attention to climate change, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it does mean building walls and keeping people out and so on. On the third point about, you know, is the whole environment thing the mother of all fragmentation, and your bigger point, Professor Oxley, I guess, professor, right? Practitioner. Well, okay, that's great. I guess to understand why there's a desire to keep the funding for climate change, addressing climate change, and to keep the development funding addressing development goes back to a core concern by the developing countries. That is, when they were asked to start dealing with environmental issues, starting in 1972 in Stockholm, and then 1992 in Rio, and so on, all the way up the line, they've feared that the money that was going towards their schools, hospitals, roads, agriculture, and so on, was going to be used to take care of this issue that they understand the importance of, and they do understand that there needs to be, as you said, a reorientation of development processes, and really at the core that needs to be reducing emissions. And they, of course, saw rightly, especially at that time, that it was the developed countries that needed to reorient their development. And they didn't want the money that is being diverted to something that they didn't feel like they had either the responsibility or the ability to really work on. So they wanted the money to be incremental. So there was actually a phrase, the Earth Increment, way back in the first Earth summits. And they've always said that the funding needs to be new and additional. And it has led us to a very quirky state right now where we're trying to count whether we've met our promise for $100 billion a year, which was pledged back in Copenhagen in 2009 and confirmed in 2010. We said, the wealthy countries said that we would deliver that by 2020, and we have not, right? The counting that the OECD has done puts it at about 80 billion. My own lab, Oxfam, German Watch, and a group at the ETZ in Zurich, all analyzed it and believe that those numbers are wildly over-reported. That a lot of the development aid is just being rebadged or labeled as climate aid. So there's a lot of anger, and I think the feeling is that these promises were made to try to get to global agreements, and we're not meeting our promises that we made to keep the developing countries at the negotiating table when they threatened to walk out if they didn't have a real promise of support, and that would guarantee that their development needs were still being met while we're addressing this climate change issue. And just the last thing is, of course, reducing emissions is the first part of that, but the developing countries have really been concerned that that's not happening fast enough, and they were right. And so their urgent things for them often was adaptation funding and now loss and damage funding. So while it seems like, well, why aren't we just mitigating, we should be all focused on that. Yes, we should, but this is urgent and it's happening much sooner, and given the failure to reduce emissions fast enough, this is why this stuff gets more and more important.
Thank you so much. Another round of questions. I see a question here. I see one there.
A woman way up in the back.
One way up there. So meet those two.
Oh, great.
How much?
10 more minutes.
Hi, my name is Rakan. I'm an RDR student, master degree in risk and disaster resilience. My question is about the private sector. How interested is the private sector in what you are coming up in the loss and damage concept? Especially some sectors are heavily contributing to the problem, but at the same time will be first impacted. If we take, for example, marine operation, and I will use the example again of the sea level rise, they will be impacted. Also, oil and gas operation will be impacted, which will create cascading event in the energy sector, supply chain sectors, and not even non-economic, but will be economic and non-economic for some countries. Thank you.
There was a question there, and then one way up.
I don't think I got that question very well.
Private sector engagement and loss and damage.
Actually, I found the comment over there sympathetic about the opportunities, and I think disasters, they are very different. So the Africa, which didn't emit a lot, but they're subject to the climate change. So the both adaptation measures and mitigation measures are in a way similar. So if we provide more electricity, so that will help with the high temperatures. It will help probably with drought because we can use water supply more efficiently. And so, but this also brings the opportunities. So it's not only about the losses. This is the first question. And then I have a question about, so probably because of my ignorance, I'm not from the field. So, but loss and damage, I imagine you measure it in dollars or euros, so some money units. And is there a database that collects all this information? And then another question is about the biodiversity and the losses of these natural services. Is it something that we can already measure in terms of the money units? Because, also coming from a finance background, we can really address issues only when they measured and people can feel it materiality. And finally, like really a question about the...
you have to pick
yeah, no, but it's qualification. Like there is this equity solutions that Timos mentioned. I'm not familiar, so if you can just develop it further. And that's it. Thank you very much.
What was it? About equity. Just develop the idea of equity in that space.
And then, oh sorry, there's one up there in the corner. That's the last.
Yeah.
And maybe the panel can pick the one you feel like you want to do out of the second question.
Hello, Melody Vandervoy. I'm an IRDR PhD student. I think it's actually very interesting for me because I've worked in reinsurance for a really long time, and I see a lot of value in kind of lots of traditional reinsurance products, yes, but I see a lot of value in parametric products to solve some of these problems. I appreciate that there are significant costs related to it, but just firstly to say thank you for kind of opening my eyes to some of these uninsurable risks because I think it's really interesting. On the other side, I would see that the discussion is often really far away from consumption, and maybe there is an area where we could really kind of look and try to make the producers pay the full cost, or would you see, for example, a role for taxation in accommodating the full negative externalities of production rather than kind of trying to focus on repaying for something subsequent to the loss already?
Thank you. Just a warning is that we will take about 5 minutes to answer the questions, and then I will give the panel about 5 minutes to just summarize and give their takeaway points and where do we go from here. And then we'll take a well-deserved break from the heat before the final remark in keynote. Okay, let's take the question, but then the panel can pick what you would like to answer. It's nice to see this many questions.
Emily will have a good question.
Last question. Hi, Emily Wilkinson from ODI. Do you think there's any circumstance under which we could end up having in the negotiations an acceptance of liability and compensation for loss and damage, or under what circumstances do you think that could happen? Given that there are instances, of course, of reparations for injustices, for genocide in India, for example. Just final thoughts on that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the only one I can speak.
So shall I kick off? Maybe I could say something on the measuring. So thanks for excellent question. So we're doing some work on trying to look at how to measure loss and damage. So what we've done so far is we've used existing databases for disasters and looking through that kind of data to seeing where the major gaps are. And we've just written a paper we're about to submit which shows the massive data gaps in Africa, for example, that there is basically both hardly any data on kind of related economic and non-economic losses, but also lack of data on attribution, which is those kinds of studies which show this extreme event is more likely, or the probability is more likely due to greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a massive gap in the data there. So we're also developing something we call NELD-DAT, which is a NELD database, where we're trying to set up a way to look in more detail at how we might be able to measure the non-economic losses and damages. So I'm at Lund University, so you're welcome to get in touch if you're interested in those questions.
Thank you. That's a great set of questions, and a lot of those things I haven't thought about in this loss and damage context before. So I just want to thank you, because that's been really kind of thought-provoking. I'm going to speak to Emily's question. It's nice to see you, Emily, here. It's been a long time since we've seen each other in person. So the question was about whether liability will ever be accepted within that UNFCCC space, and I don't know. I can't predict the future right now, sitting here, and I tend to be a bit of a pessimist. I'd say that seems unlikely, but what I would say is two things. One, what do we mean by liability, right? The way we talk about it, even in our workshop this morning, we were talking about it's always grouped with compensation, right? Liability and compensation. And actually, there's some really interesting work being done. Evo's one of them, kind of unpack that and unpick those things, right? And actually what we might see is some compensation without the need to take responsibility, right? And it's about kind of maybe stepping into a moral leadership or moral responsibility role. People have talked more recently about solidarity. I think one of the interesting things we found with my co-author Elisa Calieri and Olivia Serdesny was actually, at least in party submissions, kind of after the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was created, calls for compensation and liability by developing countries really went down. So that they really wanted to move beyond that, and there's quite clear evidence of that. And so there is this fear of that, and it's a taboo topic, but actually I think there's a lot of kind of willingness to try and find some ways to address these problems in kind of a technical sense, if we want to think about it in that way. So whether liability will be accepted in some ways depends what do we mean by liability. I think the second point is, does it matter outside of the UNFCCC? Lawyers have argued that exclusion of liability and compensation only applies to the Paris Agreement, and lawyers have argued that there are other places in which that could happen. So we're seeing, for example, people talking about the Convention of the Law of Seas, right, and exclusive economic zones. What happens when states disappear to their exclusive economic zones? How is that being navigated there? How do we deal with kind of liability in that space? Another area of my work is on climate litigation, right? And that's a huge growing field. A lot of funders really interested in funding climate change related cases, and I expect to see a kind of rise in law, what we might call loss and damage climate litigation. Certainly before Glasgow at COP26, the Prime Minister of Tuvalu and the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda kind of set out that actually we're thinking about going to the ICJ to deal with some of these issues. So, we have to look beyond the world of the UNFCCC when we think about these questions of responsibility as well.
Yep, just briefly on private sector engagement and loss and damage. We haven't really seen much besides insurance, which could arguably fall under adaptation. Similarly, we haven't seen much private sector engagement in adaptation. Where we've seen the most private sector engagement is in mitigation and in renewables, which then generates money, right? So we see the private sector involved in climate action when they can generate some type of profit from their action. And this has been a major problem within the UNFCCC, is how to bring in the private sector, because governments can't cover all of these costs, and we have not come up with a solution to incentivize that as yet.
Yeah, she just said what I was going to say on that. But I would just add that, in our promise 13 years ago in Copenhagen and in Cancun, we said that it would be private and public funding for climate, and it would be jointly mobilized. So there was a lot of hope, and there's been a lot of hope. I think some of it really unsubstantiated, and it hasn't really come through of funding for this kind of thing, and especially adaptation and loss and damage, unfortunately. On the liability thing, I would just agree with Lisa's points and say, that there's going to be more and more big lawsuits. And so, for example, my state of Rhode Island in the United States is suing, I think there's like 30 major oil corporations for damages that they've, for losses and damages that they've inflicted on our state while they were falsely advertising their product as being, safe and not causing harm. And there's many of these lawsuits. Some of them are from, developing countries, tribal people, from even fishing industry group in California. And then a lot of states and cities and so on. So one of the things that's been held up as something that might drive this area of the negotiations is that fear of this kind of liability, which is endless. I mean, these companies could face endless lawsuits like this. It all depends on what happens. I mean, they're just starting to get to the discovery phase where the companies have to start turning over their records and so on. So, and if that happens, then you might see some kind of a deal being struck in the negotiations where countries say, well, we'll set up some kind of compensation mechanism at least, and in exchange you will leave us on whatever, protected from liability and our companies.
Thank you so much. To end, I'll give everyone in the panel about 30 seconds to summarize 3 things. So one is, what are the takeaways from the panel? 2 is the topic of today's conference, so climate change, disaster risk, loss and damage, or action. What is it about? Or is it about everything? And 3rd, where do we go from here? And this time we started with Timos to make sure that none more, not losing out on any points.
Go.
Did you share those questions with us? I don't remember those. Yeah, one time I was sent, I can't remember by who, invited to a UN conference of disaster risk reduction where they were trying to bring that together with the climate adaptation agenda. This was like 10 years ago or more in Helsinki. And it just shows that there's sort of this historic silos in the UN system and in our humanitarian relief that are very difficult to overcome. It's a historical path dependence. It's maybe unfortunate. It's, careers were made. It's organizational sociology. I'm a sociologist. Organizations perpetuate themselves and try to grow, and you can't really blame them for that, but it is very tricky to try to make progress in this area, and they have so much in common, and I think they need to be working together better.
Good. I will say we need all climate change, disaster risk, and action, just like we need all adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. We are at a state in the world now where we are experiencing these climate impacts. They are escalating. We're experiencing them all over the world. We no longer have the luxury of only focusing on one thing at a time. We have to focus on all of these things. 30 seconds.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Adela said. I'm now seeing how difficult this has been for Timos. Everyone say what you wanted to say beforehand. And I suppose the question for everyone in the audience is, where are you going to be? Where are you going to situate? Because we do need all, but we can't all do all. Yeah. And so it's really about where do you want to put your energy in. But I'm really excited about the idea of kind of raising awareness about loss and damage and action on that, and thinking about where disaster risk fits into that. And there's a lot of kind of questions to be answered and a lot to do, a lot of work to be done. So there's space for everybody.
Yeah, so the last word, gosh, I don't know. But I guess just to give a bit of positivity and hope here, I mean, you all come with a lot of knowledge and really interesting insights and great work that you're doing. So take that with you going forward. Look to inspiring characters. We have Coco here, who's been an inspiration, I think, for a lot of the work we're doing in loss and damage. So look to those who inspire you, I guess. your new teacher. And also just to say, I guess, yeah, we all have to get involved and do things in different ways. That's just how it is.
Thank you so much to the wonderful panel.